Hey everyone, Amiya here from Resonance Astrology, and welcome to my podcast. I'm so excited having you here. And we're recording this on Friday, December 20th at, well, it's exactly 1919. So 7 p.m. and 19 minutes in Central European time. And this is part of the 12th house series I'm doing every month. And this month we will take a look at the eighth house, and I'm joined again by Duna, which is so exciting. Hi.
Hi, Amiya. So excited to be here again, and especially for this house because we already had in the other episode this the idea that we have to do this house. So you can find me at Duna Haller in Instagram and on my website, which is Duna Haller Studio PV. If you search for Duna Haller, it shows up. And this is the second time I'm in this podcast. I've also been in the Stargaze podcast, talking about Sylvester. And I do collages, music, writing, and I have my astrology readings open right now until February. When I'm gonna close them for a minute. So I encourage people to look at that.
Yeah, guys, check them out. They're discounted now a bit, right?
Yes, they're discounted as
Exactly.
well.
Great. So, yeah, before we fully dive in, I want to do a small preface as always. If you've already heard me talk about this by the eighth time now, then you totally can feel free to skip ahead. The timestamps are below and you can go right into the eighth episode. But if it's the first time you're listening to this might be super useful. So, the preface I like to do, um, it's just that we use whole sign houses, and the focus is more on ancient Hellenistic astrology. And I break a lot of this down in the first house episode. So really, if you want a deeper look, it's best to check out this episode because it forms the whole basis around the first house. And I go really in depth around like the difference between Placidus and whole sign and the degrees of the ascendant and the difference between the ascendant and the rising sign. So check out the first episode if you want to hear me talk more about that. But just the basics of whole sign is that, as the name already suggests, we put the whole sign, so the whole 30 degrees of one sign into one house. And this then forms a very clear distinction. And I also want to mention that we both do not prescribe to the astrology ABC. It's getting less and less popular, but just still, if there's people new to this, the astrology ABC is essentially where people put Aries. I mean, the first house, they equated the first house with Aries and with Mars, and the second house with Taurus and with Venus, and so on and so forth. It's sadly a very oversimplified version of looking at both of these three things and takes away the depth that all of them have, and separating will just do each of them so much more justice. So I highly encourage if anyone's still using that to start separating them. Because I mean, for me personally, the houses really only started to make sense when I looked at them in a distinct way. So
I think that is especially useful here in the eighth house because I feel like a lot of the significance, like the mixing up of significations or the way that the eighth houses look like in sort of like more popish astrology or like less in-depth astrology has a lot to do with that ABC system. And I think it gets way more in depth when you look at it very separate from that ABC system.
yeah, you're so right. The eighth house definitely got a bit of injustice done. And I mean, I could say the same about Scorpio and Mars or Pluto, because usually people would equate Pluto with Scorpio. So really, I feel like the eighth house just gets a really bad rap and it doesn't do it justice I mean, it also doesn't do Scorpio justice to correlate it to the eighth house. So
Absolutely.
we will really, yeah, we'll talk much more about that. So yeah, that was a preface. And now let's dive in or walk into the eighth house, the gates of Hades.
Slowly
um
walking.
Exactly. So, yeah, the eighth house is called the Gates of Hades. Interestingly enough, it's a bit of a play also on the second house, which is also called the gates of Hades. But the eighth house is sort of the entrance, and the second house is the exit. So they are kind of like a portal, so to say. But otherwise, the eighth house in ancient astrology is also called the idle place, or inactive is also often what it was referred as.
Yeah, the curious thing about being called the Gates of Hades as well is that, and we'll get more deep into this, but the second house is kind of like this resurrection place where your body comes to life, your self
Mhm.
comes with your possessions, your sustenance. And the eighth house is kind of like when you carry those things to the afterlife. So it's that connection to that realm of the afterlife, of the afterworld.
Absolutely. And it's, yeah, if we look at it from a diurnal perspective, the eighth house is when the sun begins to set, so to say, and that's why it starts to enter the gates of the underworld. And that's why also the seventh house, where the sun is then fully setting or has set, is literally called the setting place. And then what happens in the second house from the diurnal motion perspective is that this is when the sun slowly begins to rise again, because the ascendant, so to say, would symbolize when the sun is rising up again. That's why it's also called the rising sign, right? So that's kind of the symbolism we have here between the eighth and the seventh house. Sorry, the eighth and the second house. Um, yeah, and just to briefly go over some other basics. The eighth house is a succedent house, and it's the third house from the third angular triad we will be looking at, which is based around the seventh house. So it's the succedent house of the seventh house, so to say. And there are no planetary joys in the eighth house. um, exactly. Yeah, that's some of the basics to get out of the way.
So, as well, from this meaning of the place where things like start to set and the place where you reach this underworld, this afterlife, the ideal place is said to feel a lot like eternal limbo, a sense of not being in motion or doing anything. It's associated a lot with idleness, laziness, weakness, stillness, inactivity. It's the starting of that phase of things dying or things falling in the
Mhm.
ground. And to give you a little bit more of context or meaning on the eighth house, I'm going to read from Abu Mazar, Introduction of Astrology, and this series of quotes that describe a little bit what the eighth house is about, and also start to get into the some of the significations and the planets where they come from. Because even if the eighth house has no planetary joy, it has a couple of planetary significators or planets that are usually associated with it, and we'll get more into why that could be. So this quote from Abu Nasar: the eighth place is called that of death, and it indicates death, killing, inheritance, lethal poisons, fear for everything that is destroyed and goes astray, and on what are deposited in idleness, laziness, and mental disorder. The indication of the eighth place is related to the one Saturn has before the native emerged from his mother's womb, and to its unfortunate, corrupting, harmful, and lethal nature. Thus, the eighth place is called that of death. For example, the eighth place indicates inheritance, all things, sorrows, anxieties, indolences, loss of mind, and other things like those that Saturn indicates. So that's where we see the first association between the eighth house and Saturn, which Amiya and I have been talking about this these days. I feel like it could have a lot to do with the fact that the significations of these houses, and we get more into this later, the grand triad between the eighth, the 12th, and the fourth has a lot to do with Saturn because it has a lot to do with death and with the
Mhm.
things that happen after life, the things that are old as well, which is a very Saturnian thing, the things that like come as inheritance, that comes as things that like other people gift us after they die. A lot of those significations are being shared between the stick houses, and the 12, which I mean, yeah, we'll get more into the future, is the joy of Saturn itself. And the fourth is also associated with Saturn in its association with death as well. So in that way, the trine from those two houses to the eighth does gives it a little bit of that Saturnian vibe that a lot of authors, I guess, differentiating the meaning of this house from other houses that are around it. Also because, as we'll see, the seventh is also associated sometimes with death and is associated with other people as well. So to differentiate it a little bit, it has that Saturnian quality that is not so important in the seventh.
Yeah, there's I touched on that a lot on the seventh house episode because while I was researching the seventh house, it was just really clear that in ancient times there was a bit of a debate depending on which school of astrologers you followed around the seventh and the eighth house and where to put the symbolism of it. Like they kind of are, I think, very closely bonded. Like they're very intercepted with each other. I think more closely than some other houses because just the meanings are sometimes a bit overlapping. And what I also find interesting is that, for example, since the eighth house is correlated with death, but in a more like broader sense, it's also related to things that derives from death, such as benefits from a death, which would be something like inheritance. And this goes back to the seventh house then, because the inheritance is often things that your spouse leaves behind. um, exactly. Or it could also go back to the fourth house, which is, the family. What do you inherit from your family? Um, so yeah, but the seventh and eighth house are very interlinked. Also because you can, like, if we would look at the money of your spouse, for example, which is a big signification of the eighth house, is the money of the spouse. And that goes back to the seventh house again, which is that's your partner, right? So there's like a big link between the seventh and the eighth house and how they're bonded together.
Yeah, also the eighth house seems to have to do more with a part of the relationship with the other, because both the seventh and the eighth have a lot to do with the other more than with the self.
Mm, yeah.
And seems to have to do with a part of the relationship that is more so out of our control or more so like touched by power dynamics. A lot of the descriptions that comes with
Mhm.
the eighth house have a lot to do with control, with power dynamics, with death, with fear, with a lot of things that are like kind of like fear of not being able to control
Mhm.
what other people are or how other people feel or how other people sustain themselves or relationship to the things that other people do for us or owe us. And so in that way, the seventh house, even though it has a tension, that opposition tension with the first, is way less, let's say, less uncomfortable than the eighth, because the eighth is not seen from the ascendant. That's where a lot of the significations of the idle place and like the place that is not moving, the planet seem to not work here, even if it's a succeeding house, which usually means that the planets work in some way. It's like you really can't see how the planets are working. It's not that they're not working because they're not in a Karen house, they're in a succeeding one, but it's you can't really like control, see, or notice how they're working. And that seems to be like a huge way of differentiating those two houses, is that like that lack of like control or like lack of visibility from the ascendant, which is not that way in the seven.
Exactly. And I guess the interesting part is because, okay, so the sixth house has fallen away from the angle from the seventh house. It used to be the seventh house and it got away. So it's often correlated with things that befall us, that befall the body, like illness. And then the eighth house is succeeding the angle, so it's bound to become the angle. And that's why I think there's this seeking control component to it because it's not there, but it wants to become the angle. It wants to become this very potent place, which are the angular places, but it's not there yet. And as you said, it's correlated with things outside of ourselves because the second house is also a succeedant house. But that one has a lot more to do with the things we have, the things we own, like our own resources. And the eighth house has a lot to do with other people's resources. And that is very outside of our control. And as you said, that can be very scary.
Yeah, I also feel like this is one of the points where the modern signification of the eighth house can be understood in a deeper way. Because we usually,
Mhm,
there's a lot of associations with the eighth house and psychology specifically,
mhm,
and like taboo topics and the occult and all those things. And I feel like a way more interesting way of looking at why those significations are in the eighth house is the fact that, as you said, the second is our resources, also our self-esteem, the things that like
mhm,
sustain us. So the eighth would be like the resources, the self-esteem, the things that sustain other people. So that's why that signification of the psychology, right? Like people who work in psychology deal with other people's stuff,
mhm.
with other people's things that sustain them, with other people's self-esteem. And that could very easily be applied as well to things that are of the occult, the things that have to do with magic and with spells that you do on other people, as well you're dealing with things that like are sustaining other people. And also with the fact that it's like a taboo place. Although I think the taboo thing is something that we're gonna get more once we get to the signification of death, because I feel
Mhm.
like in our society, in their modern capitalist society, because we don't have time to rest and to process, there's a lot of like taboo culture around death, grief, and shame.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of the eighth house is about these topics that are just not out there or even difficult for us to handle and grasp. And that's why often when planets come transiting through our eighth house, these are often topics that come up and we are kind of forced to deal with them. And all of these topics kind of involve other people for the most part, because other people make us feel shameful, make us have grief.
And I am gonna start like my recommendation of a book for people who want to learn more about the eighth house. It's not specifically like it's not about dedicated to the eighth house, but it's about dedicated to the astrology of grief. It's called Life After Grief, an astrological guide to dealing with loss, and it's by Darlene Gunsberg. And it starts. This is literally the start of the book, the first chapter.
Mm,
It says, in the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin stated that there were only two certainties in life: death and taxes. In truth, the two things that are most certain in life are death and time. Death and time are the two great immutables we encounter in the turmoil of human life. We live with time. We will die in time. And somewhere along the path, we will experience a person intimately involved with our life, ebbing, declining, and finally vanishing physically from time. The fear of death and the experience of grief are two sides of the coin called loss. This book in general, I feel like it's such a good deep dive into how you treat grief and loss within astrology. And it does mention the eighth house a couple of times. Like,
mhm.
does go into how the different placements in the eighth house can be treated. But I feel like it's even deeper because it gets into the, instead of being just this recipe of this is the eighth house and you have the ruler of the eighth, and it's more of deep dive into how to deal with these topics with the tool of astrology. So it goes more into the psychology of grief, of loss. It talks a little bit about shame as well, about this thing that we were talking about, how this capitalist society doesn't have time for rest, recover,
Mhm.
the process of grief, the non-linearity of the process of grief. And I feel like a lot of those things relate to what we have been talking about in the eighth house and kind of like tie together how the topic of death can be related to all these other different topics.
Absolutely. It's a good book. We you sent me a few pages. I think it's great to again deal with these things because it's often eighth house transits. feel so like you can't really prepare for them because you don't really know what's gonna come up. And that's kind of why the eighth house is associated with these hidden things, because you don't really know until a transit comes up and brings forth these topics. Like if you have natal planets in the eighth, it's often things you can't really fully grasp or see that are impacting you. And then there's a transit comes along, and suddenly you're like, oh, this is what, yeah, I don't know, Saturn in my has been doing. Oftentimes, eighth house transits involve crises moments because crisis moments force us to deal with these topics, especially, things like somebody dying is very much a crisis moment. And I think then it kind of goes back to the notion of the idle place because all these feelings like shame and grief are so stubborn. It takes so long to sit with them and feel them through. Like it can take years and years to go through shame and grief that happen throughout our lives. And that's why so many of these topics they're encompassed in the eighth house and it being called the idle place. That's kind of why they feel like internal limbo. And I was also thinking before because we were touching upon the subject of anxieties and fears, which is very eighth house. It's a lot of where our like paranoia comes from and stems from if we have issues dealing with that. And if you think of what is anxiety, well, it's like something you can't fully grasp. And that's like it's an aversion to the first house. That's why it's associated with fear because it's something we can't grasp. It's like you're living your normal life and then what you're I don't know on a train and suddenly your body feels threatened. That's the eighth house. It comes out of nowhere and you're like, why is this going on? This is how eighth house transits can feel like. And I have a bit of a like personal story that I can share since I have my natal moon in the eighth house. And this year, Jupiter has been going through my eighth house, going over my moon, and I feel like I've became very aware of just how much I am hiding my emotions from the outer world and how much trouble that causes me because it doesn't really feel authentic, right? It's like I'm hiding something from the world. So then obviously existence becomes pretty threatening because you feel like the way that I am is not okay to be. And I think that's what a lot of placements in the eighth house can often symbolize. We feel like something there is just linked to shame and like it's not okay to be that way, have these feelings. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
No, that's great. And, I mean, not the content, but like the
Yeah, no.
the awareness of it.
Astrologer good.
No, I think it's also very like serendipitous that my progress moon, it's now like in the middle of my eighth house, and it
Hmm.
entered my eighth house right around the time that Amiya and I started talking about astrology, which is very interesting because it's like we were meant to do this episode.
Hmm.
And also, I feel like I mean, and I'm big disclaimer here, I'm not implying that traumas or difficult things are actually like needed or good. When I say that sometimes the eighth house teaches us to deal with grief, loss, shame, and those things, that doesn't mean that people deserve to feel bad things or that bad things make you better or any of those things. I don't subscribe to those things. I do believe that the process of how we deal with bad things, because bad things happen in every human's life, the process of how we deal with them is what can show us more about ourselves, not so much bad things happening to us in themselves. And I am actually going to read another quote from this book because it relates very much to it and why I think like there's ways that like we as a society could relate way more healthily to the eighth house topics.
Hmm.
It says, any capitalistic society is an acquisitive society. From an early age, we are taught to look outwards and to acquire things, emotionally as well as physically. Our parents love and respect. a good education, a job, a house, car, and a family of our own. No one teaches us what to do when things pass out of our lives or when the goals we set are not achieved. No one teaches us the true meaning of feelings of failure and despair. And I feel like here is where a lot of the significations of the eighth house that we as a society could live way more heartily and better is just having an explicit and true relationship with these things, with loss, with grief, with death, with shame, instead of just hiding them when they happen. And again, that doesn't mean that like people suffer bad things because of any like sort of like higher reason or anything. That's not what I'm implying at all. It's more so that like since bad things or things that are difficult to deal with or out of control are meant to happen either way, in one way or another, it could help individually and collectively shape shift our views of that so that we can relate to them in a like forward way, talk about them, put them out in the world, and yeah, process them.
Yeah, I think the number one antidote to shame is love. And you heal that through relationships to yourself, but a lot of shame will come undone by treating shameful topics with other people. So making the invisible visible. That's like the first antidote of everything, even fear. If you can just name your fear, say it out loud, it will decrease so much. Because the eighth house is so much the things that are like somewhere in our head, outside of our control, or that's at least what it feels like. It's just befalling you and it's coming out of nowhere. But if you can say things as they are, it will feel so much more stable already. And that's why, as you said, it's so important to talk more openly about these topics because they can be buried for so long. I mean, that's kind of it comes back to the trine with the fourth house and family lineages. Because secret keeping, lying, all of these things, not telling the truth, that creates a lot of shame and guilt and punishment for so long. And until eventually somebody deals with it, until eventually someone's like, let me uncover that. Yeah, and I think one thing I really wanted to also talk about, which we haven't touched so much on now, is this eighth house in correlation with karmic entanglements. I also took there's a workshop by my astrology teacher, Adam Allen Bass, Nightlight Astrology. Please check him out. He's lovely. But he did a workshop on the eighth house and he talked about it in form of karmic entanglements, which I find very fascinating because I also realized, and also in other people's charts, I saw that there is this component of also because the eighth house is correlated to contracts, that it almost feels like there's some sort of agreement that happens. And often, while the seventh house symbolizes our spouse, and that's definitely if you want to call something a karmic relationship, like sure, that falls into that category. But a lot of times when we meet people that come into our lives and it's like, oh my gosh, what lesson did I have to learn this time with this person? That's eighth house transit. Because the eighth house is other people's resources, but it's also what other people owe us, which can be money, it can be materially, but it can also be spiritually, it can be emotionally. And sometimes depends on which, school of belief you're from, I guess. But if we take the notion of, okay, there was some sort of former contract in this life, in a past life, and even if you don't believe that, there's many people that don't believe that, and still they meet people and it just feels like, oh, I met this person to learn this lesson. Just it feels fated when we meet these people. There's something to exchange that has to happen, and that's very eighth house. It's pretty crazy actually how it lines up.
Yeah, a couple of more topics that I wanted to get into. One of them is just to take this out of the back, because a lot of people, the first thing that they will think when they think eighth house, and that is because of the modern, like Pluto, Scorpio association, would be like sex, which we haven't said at all till now. And I don't subscribe that to the eighth in the modern, like in the traditional sense and all of that. But I think there's some ways in which, and I say this in the fifth house episodes, because the fifth house is much more clearly about pleasure and a lot of things that are more clearly associated with sex. And I say that like the relationship between the fifth and the eighth, and that square specifically, could be something that could be worded like in BDSM, for example, or in any sort of power dynamics that are arranged through a contract. And again, this
Mhm.
reaching with the contract thing and the karmic thing and the fate thing. I feel like one way, I don't want to say like to hack the eighth house, but to just like, I guess to like turn things that can be pretty doomed and difficult into things that empower you is to be very aware of where are your weak spots in that and work explicitly through them. And a lot of what BDSM is for a lot of people is just literally that, just literally working through their trauma in a contained safe space where you decide where you want to go and how far and everything. And that is very much creating a container where you can explore the eighth house topic without it being like totally out of your control, which is the other meaning. The other meaning of the eighth house that can be pretty scary is like experiences of abuse. And the incense would talk about this specifically of possession, right? Of
Mhm.
like supernatural things. So that is like a way of working through those things in a way that can still be uplifting and healing and productive in a non-capitalistic way, just like productive to your own self, to your growth. And that also touches on how, again, the eighth house relates to the fourth and the 12th in that way of like having to do with a lot of like anguish and just mental health issues that we'll touch more when we get to the like comparison with the other
Mhm.
houses. But before we get to that, I do want to like quote a couple more of authors. One is another ancient author, which is very interesting because I was talking this with Amiya. Firmicus, which is a Latin Roman astrologer, he talks about the moon rejoicing in the waxing moon rejoicing in the
Mhm.
eighth in night charts, very, very specific. And
Mhm.
I feel like that may have to do with the way that the eighth is like about other people's resources, as well as if you have like Jupiter or like benefic in that house can very well manifest in this way as well. It's very much like the moon when the sun is not like when the sun is not on the sky over the horizon and is obscure in the light of the moon. And as well when the like phase of the moon is productive to that wealth acquisition can very much have this joy in the eighth. And that is obviously like debatable. Like there's only this author talks about this. So it's not like the third house. It's not like a place that 100% has a joy of the moon.
Mhm.
But it's very interesting to see that reference because it does give the eighth house also a moon-like signification. And I want to read the quote and then I'll explore a little bit more of that moon Saturn thing.
Yes.
So the first of these remaining four houses, however, which is located in the second house from the ascendant, is called the gates of hell. That's the second house, or the anaphora, rising up from the underworld. The house which is diametrically opposite to this house, that is the eighth from the ascendant, is called the epicataraphora, casting down into the underworld. But it is necessary for us to know that no planet rejoices in this house except the moon, and then only in nocturnal charts. If the waxing moon is found in this house in a nocturnal chart, and if she is not in aspect to any unfavorable planets, and if Jupiter is in trine or sextile aspect to her in her own sign, or in the sign of Venus or Jupiter or Mercury, or in the terms of any of these planets, this portends the greatest good fortune and riches beyond measure, great glory of material power, and outstanding recognition in worldly position. I'm just gonna mention here that it is very funny. I found like a couple of examples, and I'm not gonna get deep into this because it would be a lot of time. But I found a couple of examples of this working in real life, and those were the chart of Jim Carrey and the chart of Willem Dafoe. Both of them had this very weird
Mhm.
moon configuration in the eighth. And again, that does seem to relate the eighth house to both Saturn and the moon. And with all the things that we've been talking about till now, I feel like that ties the eighth house a lot to that meaning of idleness as like a slowing of time, or like like kind of like hyper perfection perception of time, or like weirdness of time, that I feel is very moon Saturn, because the
Mm.
moon is constantly changing signs, it's constantly waxing and waning, it's constantly going through these cycles that are only 28 days, and Saturn goes to a cycle that is 28 years. So those that there's a very deep relationship between Saturn and the moon that also has to do with something that Hades was associated with as well, which is agriculture and the ribs of the ribs of the trees and the fruits of labor. All of those things kind of like relate to time, and also because these things decay and die and suddenly can change and shift because of a storm or of anything that happens, they also kind of like make our relationship with time weird as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, like the um the time component. I mean, even in the underworld, and I read a lot about this book when I was doing the fourth house episode. It's called The Dream and the Underworld by James Hillman. Um, he's great. I feel like that book applies to the fourth, eighth, and 12th house. When I think of the underworld, time passes differently there. I think the eighth house has a bit of the quality of the whole Persephone story and her being taken into the underworld. It feels like a stripping away of innocence, if I can put it like that. And I think that's why it's also correlated to trauma to a certain extent, because experiencing something traumatizing feels like you're being stripped away from your a natural, innocent, blank slate that you were born in. And it feels so out of your control, right? Because it's something that happens to us. So, yeah, I found this quote. It's like my favorite part of the book, but there's many great parts in this book, and I highly suggest it to anyone that wants to get more in touch with, I mean, dreams in general, but James Hillman writes in a pretty provocative way, which I enjoy to really like question yourself. But let's get to this. This unknowable goal is the only absolute sure event of the human condition. Hades is the unseen one and yet absolutely present. The call to Hades suggests that all aspects of the process of the soul must be read finally, not only as part of the general human process towards death, but as particular events of and in that death. Each facet then is a finished image in itself, completing its purpose that is at the same time unending, not literally unending in time, but limitless in depth. In other words, we can stop nowhere and anywhere because the end is not in time but in death, where death means the telos or fulfillment of anything. Or we can stop anywhere because from the final point of view, everything is an end in itself. The goal is always now. And then a bit further down the road, he puts this, what is the purpose of this event for my soul, for my death? Question mark. And I really like that, especially going back to your correlation with Saturn moon, because that whole quote in how time passes differently in the underworld, where it feels like it doesn't really matter what you do because it's always just about the present moment. I mean, it's like that in real life too. Don't get me wrong, but we just try to make it out like it's not. But I think a lot of our discomfort in life, and it's not like I'm above this, I'm definitely not above this, but comes from not being in the present moment. It comes from either future tripping or past tripping. And that's what the eighth house kind of invites us to do, is to be in the painful present moment. Because feeling our emotions involves being in the present moment, and it's filled with pain. The thing is, if things got stored with pain, they will get released with pain because you haven't felt them back then fully. And the only way out is through. I think that's very applicable to the eighth house, also because it is the gates of Hades. So the only way out is through the gates of Hades.
Yeah, I love how that quote very much relates to the last one I wanted to read from the Astrology of Grief book. It also explicitly talks about the Moon Saturn relationship, which I think was just really potent. It says, for any separation, no matter how amicable, will cause a Moon Saturn reaction, feelings of rejection, isolation, and emotional pain. And that is definitely where the Moon Saturn significators of this house really, really come very clear.
Yeah, I also wanted to read a quote from a book called The Shame That Binds You by John Bradshaw. And he says, to be shame bound means that whenever you feel any feeling, need, or drive, you immediately feel ashamed. The dynamic core of your human life is grounded in your feelings, needs, and drives. When these are bound by shame, you are shamed to the core. And that's the unpleasant sting of the eighth house, essentially. um, yeah, I mean, okay, we talked a lot about the harder stuff of the eighth house. I mean, you touched a bit upon the good aspects, but I feel like, can we maybe give some more examples? Because I don't really want to scare people with eighth house transits or having planets in the eighth house. Because honestly, even for me, having the moon in the eighth house is definitely not my favorite placement at all and has been difficult. But for example, Jupiter transiting this year has served like a nice protective balm and really helped me to, first of all, understand just how many resources I have outside of myself and that it's me that has to bring up the trust to let those resources inside of my life. So it really just feels like I have kind of been shielded and I've gotten the right support. um, it did start with a crisis moment, but it ended up in something a lot better. So it's a bit of both. I think that's maybe what the eighth house feels often, where it's like, ouch, it stings, but yeah, you gotta feel it so you can heal it, kind of thing.
I also feel like the and this might sound a little bit like pessimistic on the beginning, but I follow me. I feel like the awareness of these things, like the awareness of death, the awareness of grief, the awareness of shame even, or the awareness of abuse is very much, it can very much be an activating thing to actually live your life. Because and I don't remember the specific transits, but I do have not only my experience but other experience of other people when they encounter the reality of death. It very much makes you want to be more true to yourself, do more of what you want to do, like live your life in a way that makes you proud of it.
Mm,
And I feel like a lot of the awareness of these things, and again, I feel like I'm not sure if everyone, because there are some very privileged people in the world, but everyone who is listening to this podcast for sure has gone through some time type of trauma or abuse. So like those things are unavoidable, but being aware of how they work of and also of how to heal them can change your life for the good, for the better that like honestly, a lot of other things can. That's also a power of the eighth house, being able to just make you want to do things more truthfully and more fully because you're aware of endings, you're aware of loss, you're aware of impermanence, and aware of power and of abuse. It makes you want to change things and go through life in a way that hopefully change those dynamics and that not only yourself but also other people can have better lives. That is very eighth housey. That impulse to like face those things that are very paralyzing and like stay with the paralysis until you have something to do about it.
oh yeah, I love that. It's because yeah, sometimes we have to sit with the paralysis too. We have to feel paralysis instead of avoiding it. And then we can feel a lot more free. Um, yeah, the eighth house really is a lot about the present moment as well. which similar to the fifth house, right? The fifth house, obviously, in a more pleasant way than the eighth house. The eighth house is more just sitting with the uncomfortable things of the present moment. So,
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel like like just getting to just so people don't get like this, like what you said that like this feel that this is only like bad things in the eighth.
yeah.
If you get, for example, a Mars or a Saturn transit in the fifth, it can feel very icky and painful. And maybe transit of Jupiter or Venus in the eighth can feel more like you being aware of things that already bothered you when you weren't aware. But now you can do something with them and work through them. So, as you said, no house is totally bad or totally good. I feel a lot of why the eighth house, when we talk about these topics and go through them, feels bad is because we as a culture don't deal with these things a lot.
Mm.
Not because these things are inherently topics that always bring bad things to us.
Yeah, exactly. It is a difficult place. It's associated with being difficult, and that's also valid. We have to have house topics that correlate with these experiences. Otherwise, we would be spiritually bypassing it, and we don't want that either. Yeah, and I also talking about transits, having Saturn, for example, go through eighth house, I've seen it correlate with people getting sober and being like, I'm gonna quit addiction and face the present moment and not run away from it anymore, which can is hard, but it's a good thing. I mean, it depends on dignities, right? Because, next year there's going to be people that are going to have Jupiter in Cancer in its exaltation transiting the eighth house. And that could be an abundance of resources from other people where you're like, whoa, I didn't know there was so much support out there for me. I'm overwhelmed with all these people wanting to help me or getting financial aid all of a sudden, or your spouse's income rising drastically. So exactly. It doesn't have to be that crazy. It can also be very good. Because I know a former friend of mine had Jupiter in Pisces, which is the home sign of Jupiter, transiting her eighth house. And this is when her grandfather it didn't pass away, but decided that he's gonna prematurely already give half of the inheritance to her. So,
I've
you know,
seen I think in a video that you sent me, I've seen, but in more places, I've seen astrologers suggest when you have eighth house transits to ask for your parents to give you their inheritance at that time when they don't die. It feels like hacking fate.
yeah.
And I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it feels funny. Also, tying this up to the last quote that I want to read, which is from the Meter George's
Yes.
and Astrology book, the second volume, which is the one that deals with the houses.
Mhm.
And I'm going to read the quote and then I do want to get a little bit deeper into this.
Mhm.
Investments, trusts, loans, alimony, child support, and welfare subsidies, the goods, coins, jewelry, and furnishing buried with the dead, as well as the distribution of the goods and of the dead, including wills, legacies, and bequests, were understood as eighth house matters. The losses of the eighth house were not only people but also finances from business failures, debts, lawsuits, and taxes. The Hellenistic astrologers, in their interpretation of planets in the eighth house, as with its opposite, the second, focus upon the native's general good or bad financial matters. And I do want to touch a little bit on why or how this was treated in specifically in Hellenistic astrology with their
Mhm.
vision of life, and also in Egyptian astrology as well, which is a little bit earlier. There's a lot of association of death with legacy, as well as what was considered to live or to have a successful life and a successful death as well, was to live with like everything, kind of like your belongings in place, your inheritance for your hair or whatever that was gonna inherited in place, kind of like a good way to die, if you will talk about such a thing, could be to have every earth mother close, So you go to the afterlife with no remaining things that tie you there, which is very ghosty. And we'll talk about this when we talk about D4 and D12. That feels very much like giving death a value as well. And this goes back to the pharaohs in ancient Egypt being buried with all their things surrounding them. Like when you are in your bed and you have all your books around. Eh, so
Yeah.
it's like that kind of image of like the things, the wealth of how you lived. Your life feels is more valuable because you did a lot of things. And that's what remains of the things that you did. And that feels, to me, like a very positive way of reading the eighth house because it's dealing with death, but it's also dealing with the fact that you're living this world not only with more things. You came here to do things and to make importance in others people's life.
Hmm. Yeah, and as they say, you live as long as you're still in the hearts of the people that are still living. So it feels a bit like a legacy, although legacy is not really associated with the eighth house. But
But I
I think
think I
it,
will talk
yeah.
about this when the sextile. But I think that even though legacy is not associated, the preparations for legacy are like
Oh yeah.
getting your shit together. So when you die, it's like a positive impact in other people.
Yeah, yeah, in a very simple way. Maybe Venus transiting your eighth house could be like, I'm gonna write my will. To tie it a bit back with the seventh house, and going back to because I quoted Esther Perel in the seventh house, and she said the quality of our relationships determines the quality of our life. I think the number one component, just generally in people's lives, no matter how much they had or didn't have, it substantially made a difference if they had the feeling that they have good relationships or not. And this also just feels like, other people's resources, because after you pass, it's like, who is gonna come to your grave? Who is gonna grieve for you? And what is the impact of your death? And how do you want people to remember you? Which again goes back more to legacy, but yeah, it's kind of tied together in that way. And there's also a reason why the eighth house is in sextile with the 10th house, which is much more about legacy. So, but yeah, we'll talk about, I mean, we can kind of jump into
Yes,
talking
I feel
about
like
the
we've
the
been wanting
houses
to.
now. Yeah.
I feel like we've been wanting to get here. So
Absolutely, yeah.
let's go.
Okay, so let's talk about the opposition first from the eighth to the second house.
Yeah. So both houses are about possessions and about
Hmm.
the things that you have or the values that you have. And there's a very distinct, like, there's two places in your chart where three places, because these are two houses, but another house where also values shows, which is the ninth. And that's more like ethical values. But the second and the eighth is more like the values that sustain you, what you find valuable, what you
Hmm.
live for. So that's the second. And the eighth would be like what other people related to you live for, or what you leave behind when you die, which we just talked about. The whole thing of the Egyptian culture and the Babylonian culture
Hmm.
and being buried with their possessions. And the culture around death, of dying, is not the end of your life. It is the way that you leave things for other people as well. So that like tension between your possessions, the second and the eighth, can be any sort of like relationship between those two things, right? Like you getting an inheritance, your children getting an inheritance from you. Any type of like relationship between what you have and what you owe or what you get from other people is very much like that opposition of the second and the eighth.
Yeah, yeah, and it doesn't like the opposition doesn't feel so opposed like the other
I feel like
oppositions.
a lot of oppositions are very like dynamic. Like they don't feel like super uncomfortable aspects.
Yeah, yeah, but especially the eighth and the second because it just feels like this gateway between them where it doesn't feel so much like because when I think of the 10th and the fourth house, that feels very opposed. It's like your public self and your private self, which can really be two opposites on both ends. But the eighth and the second house just feels like a passage more than a opposition, so to say. Because it's not, it's like, okay, my possessions versus the possessions of others. We go into the entrance of the gates of Hades in the eighth house, and then the second house is the exit of the gates of Hades. As you said, all opposites are kind of the coin from different sides, but especially the eighth and the second. It doesn't feel like there's such a huge tension as when I think of the angular houses. They are quite
Hmm.
opposite in their nature.
I get why you say that. I feel like I was thinking of, I feel like the way that oppositions play in the second and the eighth, because of the significations of the houses,
Hmm.
it feels very less opposite, even if the signs are the same, than when the same signs play out them in the first of the seven or the fourth of the
Hmm.
10. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add. I think we talked maybe the most about the
Yes,
supposition.
this
So
opposition.
let's go to the trine between the fourth, eighth, and the 12th. And you had some super good things to say about this.
It's I took a lot of this, and I might write something about this someday. I took a lot of this from reading at least Sparkly Cat's articles on the houses, on the three of them, but they didn't go as deep into the meaning of this for the eighth. They did go deep into the meaning for the fourth and the 12th, which Alice Sparkly Cat calls the fourth is called the ghost of the basement, and the 12th is called the ghost of the attic. They didn't assign any ghosts to the eighth, so I'm adding my own ghosts here, and the ghost that I want to add to the eighth is more like the ghost of when you're possessed, or like when you have the presence of death in front of you, like near death experiences, possession, and all of that. That's
Mhm.
things that like take you into feeling like a ghost. So yeah, the reason why they call these three houses or places the ghosts, and especially again they went specifically with the fourth and the 12th, is because these are things that haunt us. The fourth house is the ghost of the basements because it's our ancestors haunting
Mhm.
us and the way that our family history is carried in our shoulders. And the 12th is the ghost of the attic because it's more so about the, and at least Sparkly Cat talks specifically about how the 12 was associated with slaves and as well as any sort of like thing that would hide people, ghosts, animals that would just be out of our sight. It's also the 12 is associated with big animals. And it's because those scenes kind of feel like too big for us. It's like they remind us of like collective pain. That's kind of like the 12 thing. It's like a connection with the collective unconscious and collective pain. So in that way, adding my own like eighth house ghosty thing, the fourth house would be like a curse or a gift from your family, something that you have an inheritance of. Again, it could be like a curse, like every generation gets this type of, or it could be
Mhm.
like if like you have this great ability to just like read tarot cards, and your grandpa also read tarot cards, and your great grandpa as well. That feels very fourth housey.
Yeah.
And then the 12 will be like just tapping into that magic or into that curse or into, and that's why a lot of people with 12 house planets have to be very mindful of how they relate to other people because they could be like, and I say this as someone with experience on the topic, because it can be like taking on the collective magic or collective curses and gifts of everyone, kind of like no filter, just like
Mhm.
getting things into your mind. And then the eighth, for me, will be very much direct. Will be like someone directly cursing you or putting a spell on you. And again, just to not make this like a scary curse, like just bad things thing, a spell can be a good spell. Can be someone being like, you're gonna be successful for the next 5 years because I'm putting a spell on you to do so. That also is in the eighth house because it's someone affecting your luck and your possessions and your goodwill and the things you get in life, but they're doing it from the outside and they're doing it to you. You're not controlling how that happens. You don't have you're not running the car is running itself from your
Mhm.
perspective. And that is very much why I feel like that would be like the ghost meaning of the eighth would be like that sort of like spell or direct like possession that comes more so from the people that you do relate to in the present moment. So not so much the past generations as the fourth or the collective subconscious like the 12th.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so good. I don't even really have so much more to add. All these places feel like haunted places, if you want to say that, exactly for these reasons. It's just like it's an interesting trine because it feels like just this hidden places from our chart, even though the fourth house is an angle. So it's not that hidden, so to say, from us as the 12th and the eighth house are. There's something of because the family lineage is also, you can also see it in the fourth house. And that isn't really something super tangible, too. And as you said, it's like it can be something that haunts you, so to say, because it's like, oh my gosh, I can't escape like the land I was born into, or my ancestors and what they did. Somehow it rests upon me. And I love what you said of the eighth house, the thing you added with it feeling like somebody's cursing you or putting a spell on you. We can also do that to ourselves, but the eighth house does often feel like because it's with contracts. And how many times do we just make contracts with ourselves or with other people based on some sort of assumptions? Like it's so easy to, because I feel like maybe people are thinking like, oh, curse and a spell, like something super out there. No, it's like just by talking to yourself and basically I don't know, assuming like, oh my gosh, I did this wrong. Now I'm gonna have to suffer. That's technically you cursing yourself if you want to put it that way. So it's very simple. Like it happens so easily on a day-to-day basis. Um, which I just wanted to add because that can be like a simple Mercury retrograde through the eighth house transit or something like that.
Yeah, I also feel like the way that the fourth house is, even though it's seen from the ascendant, it can be hidden, can be very well explained by the cycle of the diurnal motion of the
Hmm.
sun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like also kind of can explain the other two because the 12th house is like early in the morning. The sun is just like going out. And there's something about the 12th and like that early in the morning vibe. It makes you kind of don't pay attention very well because you're like you're just looking at the morning, right?
Hmm.
And you also like, I don't know, I'm a very morning person. And even though I'm very morning person, I feel like everyone is a little bit confused in those hours. Even me
Yeah.
being like someone who wakes up and does things. And then the eighth is like this point where the sun is not setting yet, but it's like in the opposite. And in a lot of places, that place specifically of the sun is when it starts to get like the sky starts to look a little bit red or like
Hmm.
it starts to get a mixture of colors. That would go deeper when you get into the seventh because it starts to actually set. But
Hmm.
in the eighth, it's like when it starts to get that kind of blinding nature, which is not blinding from the big heaven. It's not like the sun giving you in the face. It's more like this is weird. This feels like the sky feels weird. And then when the sun is in the fourth, and especially the fourth and the IC are not the same, but especially in the IC, if it is in the fourth, definitely it's like total darkness. So I feel like that motion of the sun also feels very much like why those three positions of the sun are very haunted as well.
Yeah. Yeah, they're kind of like thresholds in a way, passageways, not something fixed and right there, but something kind of unclear. It definitely gives that energy. Um, okay, let's talk about the squares. The eighth house is squaring the fifth house and the 11th house. We already touched a bit on the fifth house. Of
Go
course, the
listen to
fifth
that
house is squaring
podcast.
the eighth house. Um, but the 11th house is a new addition.
Yeah. Um, the notes that we had about this, and I feel like I don't know, maybe this is just me wanting for people to listen to your 11th house podcast as well when you do it, but like I feel like you can get better into the 11th eighth from the perspective of the 11th because the 11th is much more
Mhm.
active. So you can
Yeah.
get better the signification of that square. But I will basically put it like the 11th is like connection, community, dreams, and like the good spirit, right? Like people who help you, your community, all of that. The eighth would be in a square with it, so it's like facing the troubles of this connection and the need for, again, idleness and the need for processing and stopping and resting and not dreaming big at that point.
Yeah, there's if people have hard times with friendships, there's usually a correlation with the 11th and the 8th house in the chart. Or like the ruler of the 11th is in the 8th, or the ruler of the 8th is in the 11th, or something like that. Or there's a square going on between natal planets. What I see sometimes is that if there is a correlation from the 11th and the 8th, often people feel that there's an owing component to friendships where it feels like, or they assume, because we live on assumptions for the most part, which is very eighth house. They assume like, oh, I did something good for them. They have to do something good for me. Or now I owe them. I don't want to owe them. So I will not do anything for them. Um, and it's so interesting because I don't really have that way of thinking, but I know people do. And that impacts so much of how friendships are perceived. And I really see this as a big component of then people really feeling like, oh, I can't uphold friendships or I don't have good friends because a lot of it is based on assumptions and owing something or not owing something. Um, and even like if, because the real contractual relationship would be the marriage, which is the seventh and the eighth in correlation. But even besides that, if there's not a marriage involved and the seven and the eighth house are somehow involved together, a lot of times people have this feeling that they owe their partner something in a way. And I think that also goes to the square to the fifth, because oftentimes feeling like you're owing someone something isn't really fun. It kind of gets in the way of having fun and pleasure and what the fifth house stands
Unless you
for.
make the contract explicit.
Exactly, yeah.
That's where we
Um,
talk the other podcast as well, but the BDSM thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned that before. There was something I wanted to add to that, so I can add it now. Because another thing that because not everybody's into BDSM and that's totally fine. But another thing that can help, if you don't really want to explore or face things in a sexual way, which is totally valid, both are valid, is, things like art therapy or theater therapy or something like that, where um, you explicitly enact something that happened to you, maybe a trauma or something, in a safe environment and give it space and give it room. And this can also be very healing. Actually is very healing for most people. And it's very beneficial to do besides talk therapy, because talk therapy can only get you to a certain point. So yeah, but that's the tension of the square from the fifth and the eighth house, because a lot of the topics from the eighth house kind of get in the way of experiencing the fifth house in its sexy nature, sexy romantic nature.
Yeah, to some extent, I do feel like, and again, I encourage people to go listen to the Fifth House episode.
Yes.
Uh, but I feel like a lot of what we got, and I feel like once you get deeper into any house, you kind of like get these relationships between the
Mhm.
houses, right? But I feel a lot of the things that we made sure that people understood about the fifth house was that you have to live in the present, and like there was a lot of like releasing control,
Mhm.
and the eighth house is literally like what is out of our control. So like that feels like that tension feels like it definitely fits into the meaning of the two houses.
Yeah, and it's almost like which is oftentimes what the squares represent, because they represent tension, but they also represent the solution.
Yes.
So yeah, it's in a way, it's like, because the fifth and the 11th house are beneficial houses. It's the joy of Venus and the joy of Jupiter. And this feels like the antidote to the rougher eighth house topics. And kind of is, because what we talked about before, like what is the antidote to shame? It's like love, which is fifth house. And then community, which is 11th house. So, yeah.
Totally. Okay, let's go to the sextiles. I'll leave that to you because I feel like you're gonna do very well with these two houses.
So the sextiles from the eighth house go back to the sixth house and the 10th house. There was already episode in sixth house. So again, what else can I do but shout out to go listen to the sixth house episode? Um, haven't made the 10th house episode yet. And yeah, we touched a bit about that before when we were talking about legacy, because that feels very 10th and 8th house, like what you leave behind is and what people know you, because often there's people that get famous posthumously. So after they die, they get very famous. Um, so there's this interesting correlation too. And then there's also something about I mean, okay, the sixth and the 10th are in trine to one another. And there's a lot of the trine from the sixth and the 10th goes back to work and your career. Again, what you're known for. The sixth is more like the work you do, like the strenuous work. The 10th is more your purpose-driven work, your vocation. It's usually what your vocation is that ends up being the thing you're known for. Yeah, and then I feel like the sixth house is much more because the sixth house is also a difficult house. It's also in the version to the ascendant. Um, and there's a lot going on with like work contracts and because the first thing you do when you start working at a new place is hopefully signing a contract, and as soon as you sign a contract there's an agreement, and it's like you're trading your time for money, but you're not getting the money immediately. You get the money after you work there for a week or for a month or whatever the contract says, right? So this can be good or bad, right? Again, it's like if there's a positive transit going on or from the 6 to the 8 or something like that, you could get a super beneficial work contract that, expands your money situation and you get a raise or something. Um, exactly. But they're both, yeah, it's interesting how the seventh house is squished in between the eighth and the sixth house, which are both yeah, on the harder spectrum. And then there's just like the seventh house, like, okay.
Yeah, I also have a really good, like touching on the eighth and the tenth connection. I have a very good chart example.
Yes,
Um,
please.
it's an amazing one. It's someone with, and people who use other house systems will, I'm gonna break their brains. It's someone who has the midheaven in the eighth, which is relatively weird. Like not happens to a lot of people. The example I have, and I'm not gonna get into like a lot of like analysis with the chart because this is a chart that you can do a whole episode just analyzing this chart, is Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein. Also, if anybody doesn't know, the main reason why the myth of Persephone has been recovered, she adapted the myth of Persephone when it was not very famous or popular, and it was one of the first adaptations of that, as well as the author of the first plague novel, like it's called The Last Man or something like that. It's the first novel
Mhm.
set in a plague that destroys the whole world, which a lot of people started reading in when COVID hit. Um, so Mary Shelley is someone really important for the eighth house topics and how they have been treated in history, because again, it's like death and resurrection with Frankenstein and the meaning of life, the emotions of grief and shame, loneliness, as well as the myth of Persephone. All of those things are really huge in Mary Shelley's literary work. And she has the midheaven conjunct Pluto in the eighth house. So in the whole sign eighth house, which is in Aquarius,
Mhm.
it has Pluto and the midheaven. So there's like that connection between the midheaven and the eighth house, very specific, like it is there. And then also has that connected by sextile with the planet that she has in the 10th house, which is Jupiter in Aries. And then the ruler of the 8th is in the first. So near, very, very nearby the ascendant, like someone with Saturn rising, not an easy life. But definitely someone who had a huge legacy. And I feel like that
Mm.
connection it's not like a super connection like ruler of the like it's more difficult to analyze in the chart. You have to get a little bit into the details. But I feel like that is very like mind blowing that like her effect in the war and her the way that her writing has influenced culture is very eighth housey.
Yeah. Yeah, there's to get a bit more basic after that story, if I'm allowed, um,
Yes.
is again, if we talk more about like rulers, like the ruler of the 10th being in the eighth or something like that, oftentimes this can correlate to people that work in finance, that
Yes.
work with taxes, um, or just like um dealing with other people's money and resources and acquisitions. Um, this can also be like how do you call these people? Like people that go and buy art for other people. Art
Oh,
collect
curators.
curators, exactly. Yeah. So things like that. Or people that work that are like morticians actually can also be that work with death in some sort of way.
Very
That
much
work
so.
with on the graveyard. Yeah. Or they write the Frankenstein novels.
Yeah, I just saw that like the ruler of the tenth is in the third, so it's like writing.
Mhm.
So like those that connection between the different houses goes back to the third, which is writing and like the stories, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but
yeah, like
I love that because I think what we were talking about all the time, always, is like because when you usually see things popping up in the eighth house, there's always a component of fear, like, oh my gosh, what is going to happen when the planet transits my eighth house? And it's valid, it's totally fine. But then we need these examples, like the example you just mentioned, because it's like it could have easily gone a wrong way, but she chose a route to express this transit in forms of writing it. And that probably then led to that being expressed and manifested in this way instead of maybe affecting her or maybe her resources or whatever in bad ways. So,
I
yeah.
mean, she did deal with death quite a lot during her life. So that also is like that ruler of the ace in the
Hmm.
first significator is also there because her husband died. She was like a very kind of early widow. That didn't stop
Yeah,
her from continuing her life and writing and just like doing lots of other things. And
exactly, exactly.
I'm not sure how this relates to her chart, but and probably you're gonna take this out of the, but I think this is too good. I'm not
No,
sure
I'm
how
gonna
this
leave it
relates.
in.
I'm not sure how this relates to her chart, but she had her first like sexual relationship with her husband with Percy Shelley
Mhm.
in her mother's tomb. Like,
Okay.
so she was someone that like very much took the house energy and like ran
Oh
with
yeah.
it.
Oh
Like,
yeah. Yeah. Which again, I think is the point we kind of wanted to make is like, how can we use the eighth house energy, which is difficult, and make something useful out of it?
I'm
Which
fine.
is creating things again, which is it's a square from the 11th and the fifth house. It's like finding community of like-minded people that are also weird or whatever, and then getting creative about it because
Yes.
that's the biggest middle finger you can give to the harsh eighth house topics, probably. It's choosing love over fear. And with that, let's conclude the eighth house talk. Woo!
That was a perfect ending.
Absolutely. Yeah. My voice got super high there. I'm so sorry for anyone listening. Um, but it was a good ending, and it's probably the longest episode, so but hey, the eighth house deserves it. It's the idle place. We took our time. And I definitely hope we could bring this very intangible place closer and make it more tangible.
Yes, and to anyone who has arrived here, I feel like they deserve a reward. Um,
Yay, you get a reward.
which is the announcement that we're gonna do a workshop in the eighth house. I don't know when that's gonna happen because we're recording the episode right now. So, like,
Yeah, I
that
don't know
will
either.
happen. Yes,
Beginning of the new year, beginning of 2025, there will be an eighth house workshop where we're probably going to get much more into eighth house charts, chart examples, and discuss some further topics even more in depth, and you can come and show your chart and everything. And it's going to be super fun. So yeah.
yes, and that is definitely a good way of getting
Sorry, my
to
cat
like,
just came.
oh,
This is, I swear, if you've made it this far, like comment down below. Like you're getting a reward for sure. Free workshop, no.
yes, you can spoil everyone, like, get a spoiler for everyone else. If you've gone this far, you can just comment. The reward is a workshop. But yeah, and that way you can get these two astrologers to read your chart at least partially in this way, um, in a
Yeah,
workshop. So
free chart reading,
free
free
chart,
eighth house chart reading.
yes, free house chart. I don't even do a house chart readings by myself, so that's that. This is the way for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. We're like, we've been talking for too long now. But yeah, let's do the outro. Let's get shout out your socials one last
Okay.
time before we go, and I'm gonna do mine after.
Okay, you can find me at Duna Haller. You can search it in Google. It comes up with my Instagram, my webpage, and that's what it is there. I also do readings. There's a Calendly link that is in my Instagram and in my website and everywhere else in my Substack as well. And my readings are focused on creativity, but because a lot of the topics of the eighth house come up when people talk about how they create and why they create, I do like to look at this house as well, especially if there's like any sort of like relationship with grief, trauma, or same with art, which it's very, very common.
If you wanna stay in touch on Instagram. It's resonance astrology, resonance dot astrology. My website is resonanceastrology.com. I'm also open for bookings. You can reach out via the mail form. My email is resonanceastrology@gmail.com. And I'm also active on Reddit. I have a completely different username there. It's Haruka. I'll also put all the links down below. You can find everything down below. Juna's handles, my handles, everything you need to know, all the resources that we mentioned and the books we talked about, everything will be down in the description below. Um, yeah, that's about it. So thank you for listening to this point. And yeah, I wish you a lovely and pleasant day. Goodbye.
Bye.